to do this talk mostly, I think, for the feed guys, because you've had some dedicated time to learn Blender and a little bit of resource for it, which I'm really excited about. And the hard thing about doing this talk is that you've all done like an introduction level. And you're probably at the point where you're all fragmenting into looking into different things like geometry nodes, sculpting, particles, that sort of thing. So I'm going to leave big tutorials for you guys to go into those things because I only have an hour. And I'm going to focus mostly on tips and tricks. And that should hopefully be things that have slipped through the cracks in bigger tutorials. So little sizzle reel to start with. And this is all stuff I've made for Byte recently. And 90% of it's in Eevee, which is what I'll talk about a lot. Hopefully there's noise. Okay, and that's the little sizzle reel. I'm definitely gonna have trouble with that. Okay, so first thing I want to say is, like we were just talking about then, I'm always down to talk about Blender. If anyone's having any trouble or they've got something specifically they want to try to do that they can't figure out, just message me on Slack. I'm going to send around this document to this slideshow to everyone afterwards, just so you've got my contact details. And also, I'm going to talk quite quickly because we've got a lot to get through. So I've written notes pages in this document on everything I talk through. So a little bit of background on me. I've been using Blender for about 4 years now. I came over from Cinema 4D, and I came over mainly for two reasons. The first being that if you're working in a company that isn't dedicated to using 3D, Blender's amazing because it's free, so you can have your entire team on it. So you can have it in the early concepting stages with people who know how to use Blender less, and then hand it over to people who can like finish it up and polish it up in the final stages, rather than having it like segregated and gatekept behind like a license. So I really like that about Blender. The other thing is that it's got Eevee, which is a real-time render engine, which is the main reason why I can do motion 3D stuff off a laptop. Eevee's the best way to be working on the hardware that we have. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'll share my startup file and some of like the hidden things in that. And I'll share that with you so you can make it your startup file. Some tips and tricks on how to use Blender, essential add-ons that really should be switched on by default. Then I have a little challenge I've been asked to set you guys. I was asked to set this again, like mostly for the feed guys, but if any of the Byte team want to get involved, I think it would be really cool. Okay, so, and then probably don't have time for it, but creators to follow at the end, maybe. So this is just an example, one of the notes pages. So I'm going to switch into Blender now. And someone please tell me, can you see Blender?
No. No.
No.
Okay, what can you see now? Still slideshow.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, bugger. I've definitely shared a window though, so this should. This is going to slow things down if I have to keep switching to. Well, I might have to do it this way. Okay, Blender now? No?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank God. Okay, cool. So this is my startup file. It's all pretty normal, but you've got a few extra objects here. So you'll be able to download this from the document I send over. And what I recommend doing is if you go to File, Defaults, Save Startup File, this will just make it your default file. And it's got some handy things in there that can be useful. So first thing I want to talk about is my camera setup and the way I operate a camera. So for instance, in the shot that you saw of like the phones moving around in the little sizzle reel clip, I use a fairly simple camera setup to get that really smooth camera movement. So under the camera up here, you'll see you've just got your camera and then you've got your camera empty. So the handy thing about this is because you've got it constrained, you can then just move your camera around, and it always tracks to whatever focus of interest you have. And the other thing about this is the camera's depth of field is set to follow track to this empty. So you can see anything in the distance is automatically a little bit blurred. And you can turn this on and off just in the camera settings up here. The way I use this if I'm animating is I'll say these balls are two different kind of like points of interest on a phone. So like say this one's the microphone and this one's like a button on the side. If I was animating moving between those two positions, I'd put a keyframe for the camera in its current position, and then I'd move the camera, keyframe it in its second position, and then I'd move the camera empty at the same time, so it keys between the two. And because you've got the focus tracked to the same point the camera's looking at, you'll always have a nice slight blurring around things that you're not trying to draw focus to on the camera. And like I say, I'm going to go quite fast, but these are all things in the notes. And anything that doesn't you struggle with afterwards, I can help you out with. Other little thing we have in the base setup for this file is the lighting setup. So these are all tracked to as well. So this base setup is more, if you ever need to, say, just export a nice shot of any asset you've created, you've got this infinite kind of plane that the ball is floating in, or whatever objects you want to use. And the way this is set up is partly based off of this lighting setup, which is just a standard 3-point light setup. If I turn it off, you'll see that my lighting goes a bit funky. And this is based off of Eevee and its real-time render engine needing these lights for the shadows to work correctly. In Cycles, you won't have this because the scene's actually lit by an HDRI. So the way this infinite plane is set up, I'll just talk you guys through. So we have this shadow catcher, which I've got a custom material set up for. So if we go into the material, you can see there's quite a few nodes going on for it. And it's nothing you have to worry about. It will just work automatically. But if you are interested, I've made little notes on how the shadow catcher works. You've got two different materials set up, one for Cycles, this bottom one here, which you can see is way simpler. And then the Eevee one, which is more complicated just off of how Eevee works. The Cycles one, there is literally just a tick box for shadow catcher. And yeah, all of that setup just gives you this little shadow plane. So you can have an infinite background, but a shadow, so your object is grounded to it. The other way that this scene is built up is by the world, so this kind of gray space around it. This I've had it as a default setup for a long time for my worlds. It's quite a bit more, it's a bit more complicated than the normal setup. The normal setup, you'd probably just have something like these 4 nodes, and then you pump that straight into your world output. And that's effectively what's happening for the shading in this setup. The shading is, if I turn all of the lights off, it's still lit up because this HDRI world is lighting the ball. But what we have here, basically, this light path node tells us that all the shading will come from this forest HDRI, but what we'll actually see will be this like perfect kind of infinite gradient backdrop. And if you want to edit any of this, it's just this mix node, and you can just pick out a color for it and decide what color background you want it to sit on. You can use the factor to adjust whether you want it to be a solid color or you want that gradient in there. And then if you want a bit more control, you can adjust the gradient with the color ramp. So that's I guess the main kind of features of the base file that I'll send over to you guys, and I recommend using as a default. One of the other handy features in it that you might not have used yet is the compositing tab. Like I say, this is a hard tutorial to do because I'm not exactly sure how deep you've gone in different areas, but I'm hoping you've not used the compositor too much. And also having this as a default is just handy because you don't have to set up this little chain of nodes each time. So to get the compositor work, you just go to the compositor, tab up the top. You have to make sure you tick use nodes, and then you render any frame. And now you've got your little ball behind you. And this works off of the viewer node. So we've got that here. Without the viewer node, you won't get any image behind. And the composite node is just the output. So this looks like a lot, but it won't actually do anything unless you adjust any of these little bits of UI in between. And these are labeled and set up, so they should hopefully be clear for you guys. So we've got lens distortion, which adds kind of the sort of lens distortion you get using a real world camera. So if you're trying to go for something more photorealistic, using a really low amount of this is useful. So like just a 0.2, you start to see the color separation at the edge. We've got the color balance section, which I don't actually know the difference between lift, gamma, and gain. But a handy thing is if you just hover over, say, lift, for example, it will say correct for shadows. If you hover over gain, it corrects for highlights. So generally, what I like to do is maybe bring in like a little bit of maybe like a little bit of blue for the shadows, and then like a little bit of yellow, the highlights. This glare node, you can right click to toggle the mute, or you can just click M and it will mute and unmute. And you can see that just gives us a little bit of glare, a little bit of glow. So if you're used to using Eevee, you're used to having bloom and Eevee, but you don't get it in cycles. So with the glare node, you can get the same sort of bloom that you get in Eevee, but you can get it in cycles. We've got a Fresnel set up. So if you just turn this up, then you'll see this darkening around the edge of your shot. So already we're getting something like slightly more dynamic looking. And then we've got a little noise grain slider at the end, which you can just turn up. If you don't want your shot to look so perfectly, that's pretty heavy. If you don't want it to look so perfectly crisp. So once we render that, you'll see the original and then you'll see the composite version. And this is one of the really strong features of Blender that doesn't get used quite so often. Because it avoids you having to export your PNG sequence and then bring it back into, say, After Effects to do your post-compositing and the sorts of tweaks on like the coloring and the contrast that you might want to do. So I really recommend doing that. And last thing I want to talk about, just in this kind of default file that I'll hand over, is my render settings. So its render engine is Eevee by default, because again, just speed of iteration and the sort of work and deadlines you'll probably have similar to me. You just need to be able to get work out quickly and iterate quickly. Eevee's really good for that. So by default, you'll have the things you need turned on in Eevee to make it look slightly better, like ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space for fractions, and motion blur. And just a note, the samples with the Eevee, you can keep way lower. With cycles, they need to be a much higher number. So just talk about cycles really quickly. There's a lot of settings in cycles, and sometimes you may need to use cycles if you're going to do something like a photoreal glass bottle, something where there needs to be like a lot of light bounce in it for the object to look believable and realistic. And there's a lot of settings in cycles, but the only one I suggest you work with is this noise threshold value. I would keep the max samples really high because they won't actually come into play. So the noise threshold sample, if I put it to a really low number, it will get rid of a lot of noise before it throws over to the denoiser. If I put it up to 1, which I think is the highest it will go, you'll see we've got max samples at 4096. And if I render this, you might not actually see my render window. I'm guessing you probably can't?
No.
Can you?
No, we can't.
Not at the moment.
That's so annoying. Basically, if I render, it only gets to about, let me try and share my whole Jumping around is a nightmare for this. Entire screen. Let's go. Share. Okay. We should be back in Blender. And if I render, hopefully you can see a render this time.
Yep.
Yep.
You can see it goes up to, you may have just missed it, but it goes up to 32 samples. It doesn't get anywhere near the 4096 samples that is the maximum set. And this is because the image gets chopped up in 32 samples, and then it's done, and it throws it over to the denoiser, then goes to the compositor. This is because the noise threshold is like the new way, I guess, to do it, essentially. Your image gets chopped up into little chunks, and once the image has reached a certain amount of noisiness, like graininess, it will then throw it over to the denoiser. So having it up at a level like 1 puts a lot of the effort on the denoiser. And the denoiser works amazingly well. And if you're doing like a draft render, I really recommend having that noise threshold high. But if you've got a final render for something that needs to be photoreal with like a lot of small detail on it, the denoiser, putting too much on the denoiser will smooth out shapes and lose a lot of that detail. So if you, for like final renders, I'd probably drop it back to like 0.01. And that's my default file, and I guess kind of like basic setups. Next thing I want to jump to is basic tips and tricks for using Blender. So what have we got? Cool. So the first thing I want to talk about is just keeping your viewport tidy. So I hope you all know by now the show overlays button, just to get a kind of more render final view. If you hold Shift, Alt, and Z, I'll just toggle between it. But mostly how I like to work with this is going into it, turning off extras and relationship lines. This way you'll get your objects and you'll still get things like armatures, but when you're not working with lights or cameras, the relationship lines don't get in the way. The next thing that I think is fairly underused in Blender, but I try to make sure I use on every project, is the color management tab down in the bottom right of the render section. So what we've got here is you can make some of the changes again that you might do in post-compositing, but just with this tab down here. And unlike the compositor I showed you in the previous file, this actually works in real time. You don't have to render it out to see it. So you can change the contrast up and down. And if you've got something that really needs to pop and be quite gamey, turning it to like a high contrast or medium high is the best way to do it. It will give you a look that you can't achieve with just adjusting your lighting and your materials. Or you can turn it down really low if you want something like a little bit more realistic, a little bit more moody. You can control exposure, gamma, and you can even do RGB curves. And again, it's just much better to do this stuff and be able to see it in real time than render this all out, load it into After Effects, and then make your changes in post. Cool. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something that hopefully everyone knows, but for me, I didn't know this for ages, and it's really basic, but it surprised me. If you're literally just scaling across one angle, sometimes you want to scale all your values at once. And for this, you literally just drag down and then drag across. It's quite simple. But also, if you want to do this for multiple objects, you've got your scale. So you just select both objects, and then you hold Alt and drag, and then you can do it for multiple values. You can do this with the modifier stacks. You can do it with a lot of areas of Blender. One small difference to note on this is if we've got our objects selected, and then we scale them using Alt and drag, they scale proportionately, so the cube will always remain smaller. If you drag, press Alt, and click and release, then you can just type a number and everything will be set to that exact number. So let's just pop these back. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is, again, just using these fields. And you can do it with most times there's any kind of field in Blender. So let's say we scale this cube down to a random value, which is, at this point, it's 0.702594. It's a fairly complex number. So if you decided for some reason you wanted an exact double of that, you can just put equations in these value fields. So you can do star, which is multiply by 2, and now you've got an exact copy. So this isn't like groundbreaking in itself, but you can combine this with drivers, which then becomes really handy. Oh, one thing I've got to mention to you guys, I just click this ground plane when I want to be selecting these objects, just so everyone knows, so that you can lock things, lock layers. If you go to this filters button in the top right, you can click on the little arrow here, selectable, and then it gives you an extra row of buttons. And now I can just lock that ground layer so I can select my objects and not worry about the shadow catcher. Yeah, so equations and drivers. So we've got this cube, and say, for example, we want it to spin. In After Effects, you can use equations and drivers to do this, and you can do this in Blender as well. So what you can do is just type in hash frame, and now you've got a driver that links your cube's rotation to the frame number. And it's pretty erratic and probably a bit much. So what we can do is just delete this driver, go hashtag, type frame, and then if we do dash for divide by 10, now we've got a cube that infinitely spins without any keyframes. And what you can do with this is you can then keyframe it and move it around independent of this driver, which is a handy way to work. Just do the other one, for example, hashtag frame by 10, and you've got an infinite spin. Let's pause this and just delete all the drivers. If at any point you want to reset an object, just press Alt and R to reset the rotation. Alt and S will reset the scale, and Alt and G resets location. The next thing I want to talk about is this kind of non-keyframe style of like generative animation, I guess. So if we just bring out some windows here, and the handy thing, I didn't realize recently, you can just drag across to bring up extra windows and link them. So if we bring a timeline in here, and let's say we want this cube to be red, and we press I to keyframe that, and then we go to 30, and we want to have it hue shift to say blue. So I to keyframe that as well. What we can do now is just duplicate that, Shift B, and just handy thing about Blender, all of the shortcuts work everywhere. So Shift D to duplicate works on your keyframes, and Shift E to duplicate works on your objects. Also works in the file editor. Same with scale, move, rotate. It's handy. So what we've got here is we've just got a really basic keyframe of the hue chain. And if we wanted this to go infinitely, we could just repeat these keyframes, but it's not a very useful way of working. So what we can do is if we go to the graph editor instead of the timeline, and then we click normalize, just so we get a better view of our graph. What we can do is drop down. So if you ever can't see anything in the graph editor, just drop down these little arrows on the left. I'm going to delete the alpha channel because we don't need that information. And the annoying thing about the graph editor is you can only work on one channel at a time. So if I just select the red channel to start with, then I've got this side panel. You just press N to bring it up. Always N to bring up the side panel, or there is little arrows at the side, but they're absolutely minute. And what we can do is just add a cycles modifier to this. And then if we copy this, we can now paste it to our other two channels. So the copy and paste buttons are just in the top right, the tiny clipboard arrows. Not sure how easy this is to see. And now what we have is just an animation that cycles infinitely. And this is, it's a fairly limited use case showing it like this, but I recently had to rig and animate a zebra and give it like an idle animation where it like moved on its hoof slightly, its ears twitched, and it breathed in and out and that sort of thing. And I set that all up by just keyframing a short loop and then using the cycle command to loop all of those actions. And it's a really handy way to get kind of generative loops going. And the other useful modifier in that window is, again, if you're coming from After Effects and you're just used to being able to have like a wiggle animation, if you just want like a little movement on something, you can do a similar thing in the graph editor. So if we keyframe just on that one Z value, if I press I, it would keyframe all of these, which would clutter up the curve editor. And when working with the curve editor, you want to minimize the channels that you've keyframed on. It just makes it a lot clearer. So all we need is one keyframe, select the channel, go modifiers, and now we can do the noise modifier. And if I bring up the strength, you can just see this graph gets a little bit more wobbly. And now the cube just has like a random wiggle on it. What are we doing for time? 31. Not a lot of time left. Okay, so I actually have more kind of like little tips and tricks like this in the notes I'll share with you guys, but I'm going to cut it a little short for time. Last thing I do want to talk about is quick favorites and shortcuts, because I know a lot of you guys are going to be working on Mac, and a lot of the tutorials that you'll listen to will have shortcuts that you say the number pad keys or the F keys that you don't have easy access to. So if there's ever a shortcut that you don't have easy access to, what you can do is, if you go to Edit, you can go to Menu Search, and Menu Search allows you to just search for any command. And the easy way to access this for me is F3, but you guys don't have it. So you can right-click on it. You can do this with any function in Blender. Just right-click on it, and then you can create a custom shortcut for it, or you can add it to quick favorites. So once I've added it to quick favorites, you just press Q on the keyboard, and now Menu Search is in my little quick favorites tab. And then the handy thing about this is you can search anything like frame selected, which is a really useful command just for moving around the screen. And for me, by default, it's on the number pad, which again, you guys won't have access to. But even in the search bar like this, you can right click on a command and then add to quick favorites or add to shortcut. And that should help with tutorials that use buttons you guys maybe can't access. So that's all my little tips and tricks for the day. I just want to talk about essential add-ons that everyone should have and really should be in Blender by default. Most of these, all you have to, oh yeah, these are my notes on tips and tricks. So again, if you missed any of that, it's all noted down for you. Essential add-ons. So this one I've made a little video of just so I can skim through them pretty quickly. Why aren't they on by default? Just so that you know how to turn these on, you go Edit, Preferences, and then you'll type in this little box in the top right and just search for any of these add-ons and then switch them on. You may, I think there's about 3 add-ons I'm going to talk about that you'll have to download a zip file for, and then click on the install button in here, and then you click on the zip file and just click install straight from the zip file. You don't ever open the zip file. So I'm guessing you guys have all got Node Wrangler installed, because I looked at some of the tutorials you've gone through and I'm sure they must have mentioned it by now. But Node Wrangler is really essential. And one of the things I want to talk about is, I guess, like the essential shortcuts for it. So Control and left click allows you to preview. So you can see here, I just click on the noise texture to preview it, or I click on the principle to get the whole material back. And this is really handy for just being able to like dial in and work on one layer at a time. And here you can see I'm using that to just build in like a roughness channel. So yeah, Control and Shift and left click on anything allows you to preview. It's really handy for workflow and definitely need to use it. The other shortcut in Node Wrangler, I guess like the master one, is just Shift and W. And this brings up the Node Wrangler menu. So Shift and W brings up the Node Wrangler menu. And this gives you handy options on everything Node Wrangler can do, and then a list of, I guess, what shortcuts there are. What I'm going to show here is just you can merge selected nodes. So I've got 2 noise textures selected, and then you can go merge nodes and then use mix nodes, add a mix node, and then it will automatically mix them for you without you having to add a mix node and then connect them both up and then relink that into the principled. It's just a slightly quicker way of working. The other big one that you can access from the Node Wrangler menu is the add principled setup. And if anyone here has downloaded, say, a material from the internet and you've got a selection of different textures for it, but you're not sure how to connect those textures up, all you have to do is press Shift W, open the Node Wrangler menu, and then go to principled setup. And this will allow you to just select all your textures, click principal texture, and then it will link it all up for you. It will add in your normal map for you, add in your displacement nodes, and it will add in a mapping node for everything. So it just automatically sets up for you, which is really handy. The mapping node here as well, you'll probably want to add this a lot, and having to add both of these nodes to things is kind of annoying. And if you press Control T whilst you're on any node, be it a noise texture, an image texture, it will just add these automatically for you. Okay. So the next ones are all a bit shorter. So images as planes. Again, you just turn it on in the edit menu, but this gives you a button under import, which allows you to just import PNGs as a plane, which is really useful. So here you can see if you just under the image texture change linear to closest, you get a slightly better render, but it's minor. The main thing is once you have this add-on, you can do handy things like drop in trees, drop in logos, and they all have the correct kind of alpha and shadow. And the really useful thing about this is, say you don't even want the tree in shot, you can use this to then put a shadow onto a product that you're doing like a product shoot for, and animate the tree moving just to get the wave. Extra curves and extra objects is another really small add-on, but you can see here under the add menu, it just gives you all this long list of extra things and extra objects that you have access to as default. So there's a landscape generator with a bunch of different little options. Can we skip this? There's a rock generator, which generates rocks that you could then scatter on your landscape. Cog generator. There's a diamond generator, which I've used before for a few things. A wall generator. It's got just a bunch of different extra options. It also has options for curves. So if you've ever wanted to make like a perfect helix or spiral, kind of like psychedelic geometry stuff. And then these are all just in the add menu, and you can just select them and work with them. If you say want to put a knot around an object, it's now just under add curves, knots, and it will create a knot around an object for you. Try lighting, really simple one, just gives you lights, 3-point lighting setup. So this is the setup that I've got in the default file. So you may not need this one, but that's where the lighting setup comes from. And it allows you to just quickly make a studio lighting setup without having to put in 3 lights, position them, and then parent them to whatever thing they need to track to. Hopefully this one skips. Loop tools. So the next 2 add-ons, they're fairly small and they're editing functions. So if you're working on geometry in any way, loop tools, again, these are things that in other programs are there by default. In Blend, you have to turn on loop tools. And it gives you options for bridge, which you'll see here. So it just bridges between 2 faces, which is really useful for modeling. And then it gives you options for subdividing and different like tweaks to it you can make. You can do things like turn all the geometry into a circle. and you can do things. It's going to skip, and you can. It's got a loft function as well, which is handy, just for connecting up loops of geometry. The next one, EdgeFlow. This one you have to download from the internet and turn on like this. This one's really good for sorting out your bad topology. So here you can see there's a good topology flow, and he's messed up somehow. All you have to do is select the loop now. Once you've got this add-on turned on, you right-click and then go Set Flow, and it just magically sorts it out. It saved me a lot of time. It will do it for bunched up geometry as well. You just select your messed up loops, right-click, go Set Flow, and it will reset your flow based so it more closely matches what's around it. Ball tool, it's another kind of small functionality one, but if you've ever tried doing booleans in Blender, working with the modifier is a bit slow and fiddly to set up. Once you have ball tool, you just select 2 different objects, bring up the side menu, and then you can instantly create your boolean. If anyone's going to use booleans in the little challenge I'm going to set, please use this add-on. It just saves a lot of time. And you can see it automatically hides the cutter object as well, which you have to do manually otherwise. Really handy, easy way to model as well. Modifiers tools, if you turn this one on, you literally just get 4 extra buttons in the modifier section, which allows you to shrink them all down, hide them all, apply them all, or delete them all. And the main thing about this one is that it works across multiple objects. So working with modifier stacks over multiple objects can be cumbersome, but once you have these 4 buttons, you can just delete them all, apply them all, do whatever you need in one click. Copy attributes, I think, is probably the most important one on the list. It literally, if you press Control and C, it gives you an extra menu, which allows you to copy a bunch of different attributes. So here you can see the menu, copy location, object, rotation, scale, also modifiers. There's a bunch of handy things you can just copy. So if you're having trouble aligning objects or just getting things to, say, match rotationally, it's really useful to have, and again, should probably be just on by standard. So you can see the order you click on them makes a difference. So the second object you click on is the one you're copying from. And I think it just shows it with some modifier copying as well. So yeah, you can just copy your bunches of modifiers as well, or you can copy selected modifiers off an object. Really handy when you start working with like lots more objects. And then I think the last 2 ones I'm going to talk about, they're literally more about getting hold of good assets. So Blender Kit is the big one. If you install one add-on that I've talked about today, please install Blender Kit. It's all Blender native assets that you get for free. They're mostly royalty-free. There are some paid ones, but you can just tick a box. You only see the royalty-free ones. And it gives you access to free materials, free objects, free sculpting brushes, free whole scenes, HDRIs. And the main thing being is you can download all of these other things from the internet, but having an add-on where you just type in a search menu and drop it into a scene is so much easier. So Sketchfab, the last one I'll talk about, is pretty much the same as Blender Kit, but it only works for materials. Only works for objects, sorry. And generally, these aren't royalty-free. You can download them for free, but probably not commercial use. But it's just got such a ridiculously big library that if you ever need, say, reference to work from, or if you're just doing like mock-ups, this is a really good add-on to have. So that's all the essential add-ons. If we skip this. This page just talks about everything I've just flown through, and then has download links for the 3 that you might need. Simple Bake is the only one I didn't talk about, because that's texture baking. And you probably aren't at that stage yet, but if you ever get there, please download it. It's great. Okay. And after talking very fast for a long time, last thing I want to talk about is the little challenge I'm going to set. Primarily, like I say, for the feed guys, but if the Blender guys would be interested in joining, that would be great. The idea is that we're gonna create, I've made this little character who does a little dance, and I'll hand this file over to you guys. And the challenge is for you guys to get creative with him, design the background, redo the lighting, I've done a couple of test scenes myself just to have fun with it and kind of show the sorts of things you can make. I've mostly just ripped assets from Blender Kit so that I could do things quickly. And I'll show you a little bit of tips and tricks, I guess, how best to go about this. But the idea being is that all of the characters that you guys create will link up, and I'll be able to combine them all into a final scene at the end where they're all kind of dancing, and then I'll cut between them. So the challenge. Yeah. Redesign the base character. Do the background, do the lighting. Keep the camera and the character in place. So keep roughly the same character doing the same dance moves. And keep the camera in place so that when I cut between everyone, they'll link up nicely. Rough deadline is if you get these to me by the end of April, I can get these all together into a little video we can share around. The final slide in this document is just some useful links for working with the character and things you might want to do with it. And then what I was going to do just to wrap up was show you a couple of tips and tricks on the characters that I've made that could be useful for you guys. I'm hoping you can see Blender again now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amazing. So this is the little character and doing his dance. It's a fairly light scene. There's not a huge amount going on. And I guess what I want to do is just show you really quickly how you can work with Blender Kit. So this little search bar at the top, and how you can add things to them. So if I type in, oh, actually, one tip. Let's try moss. Search this. So you'll get all these padlocked paywall items come up first. If you just press the N tab, you can tick free items first, and then you only see the free stuff, which is useful. So what we've got here, like I say, I want to give them like a little mossy texture. I'm going to try this one. Literally, all you do, you click on the object, and it will download immediately. So now we've got a material all set up and applied to them really quickly. And you can see how you'd use this for building out a scenery as well. But if, say, the material isn't quite fitting right on him, there'll generally be a mapping node somewhere. And you can just scale this mapping node so that, for me, I want him a little bit more detailed. The other main thing that is useful to know is if you select the armature and then go on the armature tab down here, you can reset the position. And this reset button here just makes it easier to work with the character. So I'm just going to turn off extras and relationship lines like I showed earlier. So now I can still see my armature, but camera's not getting in the way. And let's try giving him something to hold. Let's try bamboo. So let's just grab, say, a sprig of bamboo trees. And then if we go into orthographic view, so just this button up here, and then we select bamboo, shrink them down, and then we select orthographic side view. We can line this up. Go back to the front, and that should be in his hand. So now if I wanted to parent this so he'll dance with it, we select the armature, we go to pose mode, we select this little ham bone here, we go back to object mode, then we select the bamboo trees. I selected the empty they're all parented to, and then select the armature, Control P parents, and then it's attached to the bone. And hopefully, now we should dance with it. So I wanted this to be the sort of challenge that you could do even in a couple hours. If you just want to have fun grabbing some assets from Blender Kit, you can still make some really cool things. The little disco guy, he's again just a Blender kit material that I've just slapped on him. The lighting setup, I'll share this file with everyone if you're curious about how any of this works, but the lighting setup is just 2 spotlights, and then we've got what would be just a normal rectangle cube, and on the shading for it, instead of the printable shader, there's just a printable volume, and it's a pretty simple node setup, but I'll share that if anyone's interested. Little plant pot dude, as you can see, he's pretty much exclusively just Blender kit assets. The way his head works is just a Boolean. I think if we quick tip on Booleans, if you under the modifiers tab change it to fast, make sure it's set to fast rather than exact, it will render a little quicker. You can see he's literally just cut with a Boolean, like the bool tool add-on that I was talking about earlier. So it's literally just that with the plant pot stuck on his head, material applied, and then a bunch of trees and plants added. The, I guess, slightly interesting thing is there's a particle system for these leaves floating down around him, and that you make literally just with a plane, and then add a particle system under the particles tab, and then you can drop in your objects. With planes, the little vortex that's spinning around them, by dropping in this mode, should be able to see this swirl. You can just add a force field, add menu, force field, vortex, and that controls the way it works. Final thing I'll talk about is the Star Wars character, because it's the most, I guess, kind of hacked together one out of all of them. This one, even though he's sat in an actual little world, it's this weird dome world, which is, it's a fun trick that you can do with HDRI images, like 360 photos. So generally people use them to light a scene, like I was showing with how the default file set up. But you can also use them on just a simple mesh. If we add in a UV sphere, if it will load up. It's literally just a UV sphere that I've used proportional editing on to, let's turn it on, just to squash it flat. And then because the UV sphere has its UVs laid out perfectly for an HDRI, it then works like this little world to place them in. A handy trick for this is if we go to the sphere HDR world, you can see on the material, it's just this Death Star world. So if you go to texture paint, and I literally just downloaded this from Google. I just Googled it, Star Wars HDRI, and you can see the UV is laid out perfectly automatically over it. And the fun thing you can then do with this is you can plug the image into the bump node, and this will just make things a little bit rougher. So you can see the floor just has some texture to it. There's a little bit of grain around the wall, but you can also plug it into the emission, and now you have control of the lights from what is just a still image. And the way that works is you run it through a color ramp. And little tip, the color ramp normally sits on ease, which gives you a gradient. You can click on this menu and change it to constant, and now you've got a harsh fall off, which allows me to just pick up the highlights in the scene. And then you pump this through a multiply node, because color ramps only put out black and white, black being 0, white being 1, and we need a higher value than that. So you run it through a multiply node, and then you've got your kind of glowing scene around you. The little character himself is made from another sort of texture trick. If we go to the UV editing, you can see he's literally just made from BB8. I've just stolen the texture. We just hide everything else in the scene. Shift H. Oh. And you can see he's literally just made from a single BB-8 texture. And the way I've then unwrapped him and moved it around is what controls the appearance. So handy tip, if say if I hover over this UV and press L, it will just select the UV, even though my UVs are really messed up and complicated and layered over each other. It'd be hard to select with just a normal grab. If you hover over it, press L, it only selects connected. And this works for geometry as well. So say we do something messed up with the geometry and you are struggling to then re-separate your geometry, you can just hover over it, press L, and then you can delete your geometry. And this is pretty much how I've made all the texturing on this little fella. You can see, for instance, we could just reposition this, and then maybe it would be cooler if we had a little visor. And using textures in this way means you get like a lot of this kind of like natural grime and stuff that if you were building a texture from scratch, you wouldn't get. So people often use this technique with, like, say, a dilapidated building, hard word to say. But if you use it with anything that has natural kind of like dirt and grime on it, you'll get that through in your character. All right, I think that's the end of me talking a lot for a long time without stopping to breathe. I hope that was useful. Does anyone have any questions?
That was amazing, man. Thank you very much. I mean, it's so overwhelming, makes you feel like you're a complete ignorant on everything in the world. So much knowledge in just 1 hour. I guess it's so good that we're recording this. I'm pretty sure all the feed mates will for sure go back to revisit these little tips and tricks. You, and this is only for the feed guys, you heard this 1 month to complete the task. So yeah, good luck with that. Thank you very much, Thomas. I don't know if you guys have, probably you have tons of questions. You don't even know that you have. But yeah, I guess just shoot directly at Thomas with them. And yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to say anything. I mean, this is completely overwhelming.
Just last thing I will say, like I said, I went through so much stuff there, but I've made notes in that document. So anything that was too fast or you want to go back and try yourself, there's notes on it in there. And if any of it doesn't make sense, please give me a message. And I hope that there was some stuff people did know and stuff people didn't know. It's kind of hard at all different levels. So I hope it was useful. Thanks.
100%.
Just one question, out of curiosity. You said that it has been nearly 4 years of you being using Blender, but how long did it take you from start to doing something? Because yeah, what you have shown us is incredible, and I'm pretty sure that you do also even more complex things than this. So yeah, just wanted to learn a bit about your learning curve.
So it's a little different for me because I guess I was using Cinema 4D before. So some of the basics like UV unwrapping, that sort of thing, like how materials set up, I kind of had in my head already, but I think probably about a year in, and like with people, maybe like even 8 months in, people that I've been working with at Byte who've been picking it up. About 8 months in, my friend Taylor, who's not with the company anymore, actually, she led, I don't know if you remember at the start when I showed the kind of little sizzle reel, she led the project that was the care bottles, the glass bottles moving around. She led that whole project. After maybe a little less than 8 months, but I think she got good by about 6 months. She got that project at about 8 months. And the really nice thing about that was she wasn't a 3D person. She wasn't someone that we'd normally go to for 3D. But because she was, what's the word? She was normally on like pitches and concepting. She could then use that knowledge and pitch something for a client that didn't have money for a shoot, pitch this 3D thing. And then she did enough to get the client to like the idea. And then it could be handed over to someone like me that could tidy it up and just make it that little bit more photoreal. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good framework. So obviously we are not going to spend our days on 3D generally. But if there's something that we're just trying to put together, at least we know we have enough knowledge just to present something that is decent, and it can be moved to kind of like a final art to Thomas or somebody that actually knows what they're doing.
I think it's so valuable because you lose so much creativity when you just segregate it like 2 people that are allowed to have a license, which is how I've mostly worked in companies, and it's been really fun seeing more people have access. Yeah, and I'll try to make sure we're all in some channel somewhere, so when you guys are working on the challenge, you can like fire questions at me, and I can help.
All right, man. I think this is all. We all have like our Slacks are kind of like beeping every 3 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. I'm going to start recording.
Thanks, man.
I'll share the recording with everybody.